Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about the construction and the ratification of the US Constitution. And in the last video I was talking about how the Articles of Confederation represented what the colonies wanted at the time of the American Revolutionary War. They wanted the independence of the colonies or the states to be guaranteed. But that after the Revolutionary War, the challenges of not having a stronger, more centralized government start to become more apparent. And so a federal convention is called that works for about 4 months and is led by a man called James Madison from Virginia, who was a political theorist and had read a lot of political theory. And at the end of these 4 months, they have a draft of a new constitution. One of the things one of the assumptions that the Constitution was based on was a direct relationship between this national government and between the people. So before, remember, it's like a pyramid scheme where you have the people who have a relationship with their states, who have a relationship with the government. And it was recognized by this federal convention, who are known as the framers of the Constitution, that wasn't going to provide an effective national government, that the people had to have some kind of direct interaction with the government. There was also a recognition that an effective national centralized government had to be able to raise taxes, had to be able to borrow money, had to be able to raise a military, had to be able to pass laws. The power to do all these things, therefore, had to be taken from the states and placed in the hands of this new federal government that they were creating. And this process is what becomes known as federalism, where states that were previously increasingly independent or largely independent give up some of their power in order to give up some of their power to a more centralized government. So in that sense, you're strengthening the centralized government. But remember, the framers are Americans in the late 18th century. They don't want to create a monarchy. They don't want to create an overwhelming centralized government. And so, although they want to give the centralized government this power to lead the nation, they want to prevent the government itself from becoming overbearing. And so they work on the other principle of the separation of powers. So there are two principal assumptions at play here. The government has to have a direct relationship with the people, and there has to be a separation of powers within the government. And so they divided the government into 3 parts. And most of you are probably pretty familiar with this already. There's a legislative part, there's an executive branch, and there's a judicial branch. And the framers were very clear that they intended the legislative branch to be the most powerful, because it best represented the will of the people. And they divided the legislative branch into 2 parts. One, the Congress, that best represented the best things of democracy, that people are directly engaged in the government, that they are choosing their representatives, who will be called congressmen, and that they choose them every 2 years. So it's very easy for people to be very engaged in government and changing the government if they don't like what it's doing. And that the Congress, the number of congressmen sent from each state would represent the population of that state. So the larger population of the state, the more representatives it would have. And so this is designed to prevent the government from being dominated by quite small states, or small states having a disproportionate amount of power and influence. The second part, or the second body in the legislative branch of government, would be the Senate. The Senate was designed to restrict the weak aspects of democracy. The people can be very fickle. You can have people elected for 2 years, then they elect someone completely different. People's ideas change dramatically and very quickly. And so the Senate was to be elected by the state governments. It was supposed to choose prominent citizens to represent their state for 6 years. So it's a much longer term. They're elected by the state government, so they're much more representative of the elites than they are representative of the people. And it's supposed to be a check on Congress moving too quickly. and instead to ensure that Congress is moving slowly, that it has widespread support. The number of representatives is simply determined by the state. It's 2 per state. And so this was designed to prevent smaller states from being overwhelmed by all the representatives that would come from the bigger states. So that's the legislative branch. Now we come to the executive branch. The framers of the Constitution were very worried about this branch. They wanted there to be an executive body to enforce the laws, but they wanted to make sure that it could still be controlled by Congress. So even though they made the president the commander-in-chief and gave him a veto over Congress, they gave Congress a way to override that veto, and they refused, and a way to impeach the president, and they did not give the president the power to declare war. The last part of the Constitution, the last branch of government, was the judiciary. And the framers didn't spend much time on the judiciary. The judiciary wasn't supposed to make laws, it wasn't supposed to enforce laws, it was simply supposed to interpret the Constitution. So now we have the framework of government. Now, there is an issue here about slavery. So there's all this rhetoric about freedom, there's all this rhetoric about people, but then you have this large portion of the population that's being cut out, that's not being spoken of as the people. And that's the increasingly large numbers of African slaves that are especially found in the southern states. By the time we get to the 1780s, certainly by the time we get to 1800, most northern states have recognized this discrepancy of fighting for liberty but still holding slaves. And so most northern states, all northern states actually by 1800, had either emancipated all their slaves or they were in the middle of a process of gradual emancipation where all the slaves would be free. And so this division between the northern states that want to in some way include slaves in the rights guaranteed by the Constitution, and southern states who assure the northern states that they will walk away from this if the institution of slavery is not maintained. And so in the end, the word slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution at all. It's just kind of glossed over, and this is a portion of society that's not going to be represented by the rights and opportunities that the Constitution is supposed to offer. And so we move from the Constitution, from the construction of the Constitution, to the ratification of the Constitution. It had been agreed that the Constitution would have to be approved by 2/3 of the states for it to go into effect. And so we find that 2 parties emerge among the colonists. The Federalists, which are people like Alexander Hamilton, which are people like James Madison, which are people like Monroe and John Jay, who are promoting the ratification of the Constitution, encouraging states to approve the Constitution and ratify it. And then we also have the anti-federalists, those who see this new government that's being constructed as a threat to the liberties they had fought for. And generally, these are kind of the older generation, people who have been heroes in the Revolutionary War, in the times of resistance to British rule, people like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry. This is the group that Monroe fits into. I'm sorry, Monroe is an anti-federalist, not a federalist. And so both these sides campaign either for states to ratify the Constitution or for states to reject the ratification of the Constitution. And pretty quickly, it's clear that they're going to get enough states. They're going to get the 9 states required to ratify the Constitution. But it's also clear that that won't really mean anything if New York and Virginia don't ratify the Constitution. These are the largest and the wealthiest states, and they're right in the middle. If they refuse to join this government, it's going to be a weird mishmash of the deep southern states and the New England states with kind of nothing in between. And so the compromise that is agreed by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that enables the Constitution to be ratified in these 2 most important states is that they will ratify the Constitution on the understanding that there will also be a Bill of Rights passed. A Bill of Rights that's designed to protect the individual from the overreach of government. That there is still a worry between There is still a sense of worry that this new government could be too powerful, could be too overbearing, and the Bill of Rights is supposed to protect that. And so the Bill of Rights is supposed to protect individual liberties in terms of freedom of religion, in terms of the freedom to bear arms, in terms of freedom of assembly, and freedom to a fair trial. And the articles of the Bill of Rights are added as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now that we come to the implementation of the Constitution, so the Constitution is ratified, you have this new country, the United States, that has agreed its new government, that has voted through its new government. All this, of course, unprecedented, at least since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and certainly more organized than they were. And you find that there are differing interpretations on how the Constitution should be implemented, which reflect different visions of what America should look like among the founding fathers. You have one group that come to be known as the Republicans. Republicans are led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Their vision for America is that America is supposed to be a nation of small farmers who can live free and live independently. And so, therefore, they want the Constitution to be interpreted very strictly, and they don't want to see the federal government become any more powerful than exactly what's laid out in the Constitution. On the other side, you have the group that becomes known as the Federalists. These are led by people like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams don't trust individual small-time farmers. They want to instead trust the authority of the government, trust the authority of the elites in society. And so they hope to interpret the Constitution very broadly. That this is kind of a basic framework, but then the new government is going to build out from that in order to best serve this society going forward. And so that can incorporate new institutions, new powers for the federal government that aren't explicitly contained in the Constitution. And so these are the two different movements that emerge. One way to think about how these interpretations are different is to look at the French Revolution. And so people have different approaches to the French Revolution that you can see even today. For some people, the French Revolution is a necessary rebellion of ordinary people against an oppressive ruling class. And the excesses of the French Revolution, where lots of people died, that was regrettable, but it was necessary. That's the focus of the Republicans. That's the interpretation of Republicans like Jefferson and Madison in the United States. For the Federalists, they look at the French Revolution and they say, this is a terrible act of mob rule that leads to lots of people dying, that leads to lots of things that people care about being stripped away. These are the dangers of unrestricted democracy. This is why you need an elite governing class that can protect a nation from this kind of chaos. And this is the approach of the Federalists. So that gives you a sense of how the Constitution is developed and how different schools develop of how the Constitution should be implemented.